Imagine performing this incredibly grueling physical ritual, right? Like every single day of your life.
Oh, man. Just endless repetition.
Yeah, exactly. You wake up super early, you restrict your diet, you memorize all these really complex recitations,
All right.
and you execute every single physical motion just flawlessly. And you do this for decades.
A literal lifetime of dedication.
Right. But then imagine at the end of your life, you were told that every single ounce of that effort was completely worthless.
Oh, wow. That is, yeah, that's brutal.
And it's not because you did the physical actions wrong, you know? It's because you forgot to ask one fundamental question.
Which is,
Why am I doing this?
yeah, I mean, it is a terrifying prospect, honestly.
It really is.
Just this idea that blind devotion, like the very thing we usually praise, could actually be the exact thing that invalidates your devotion.
Totally. Because we usually assume religion is about the exact opposite of asking why.
Right. We assume faith is about, shutting your eyes.
Yeah, turning off your critical thinking, just trusting the invisible.
We basically equate piety with an unquestioning mind. Like, the less you question, the holier you are.
Exactly. But today's stack of sources claims that this assumption is not just wrong. It actually argues that demanding magic and relying on blind belief is a profound insult to human intelligence.
Which is just a wild claim to make.
It is. So, welcome to another deep dive. Today, for everyone listening, we are exploring a total paradigm shift.
We really are. We're looking at this deeply philosophical and exegetical text.
Yeah, and it specifically analyzes the opening verses of chapter 10 of the Quran, which is known as Surah Yunus.
Right. And the central thesis we were exploring from this author, the core of what we're talking about today, is what we're going to call the logic of revelation.
I love that phrase, the logic of revelation.
It's so good because the author is taking the original Arabic terminology, right, and pulling apart the linguistic roots.
Yeah, going really deep into the actual words.
Exactly. And presenting this framework where religious signs, what the text calls ayat, are not, like these mystical, supernatural wonders.
Right, they aren't magic tricks.
No, they are objective, measurable data points.
Which is such a modern way to frame it.
It really is. They are meant to be analyzed by the human intellect to actually understand the reality of the world we live in.
Okay, before we go any further, I want to make a very explicit disclaimer for you, the listener, because this is important.
Definitely.
The source material on the table today deals heavily with specific religious and theological doctrines.
It does.
But our goal in this deep dive is completely impartial. We are not here to endorse or validate or, take sides on the religious claims of this text.
Right, and we're not making any judgments about anyone's personal beliefs out there.
Exactly. We are acting as analysts today. We are just mapping the internal logic of a highly specific worldview.
Because honestly, whether you consider yourself deeply religious or staunchly atheist, or just anywhere in between, the arguments presented by this author offer a genuine masterclass in epistemology. Like, how we know what we know.
Right, and behavioral psychology, too.
100%.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's open the book. The very first concept the author introduces is a structural claim about the nature of the Quran itself.
Right, based on its opening verses.
Yeah. So the text refers to itself as Al-Kitab al-Hakim.
Which, if you look at a standard English translation, you will almost always see rendered as the wise book.
Right. And wise is such a soft word in modern English,
It really is. We think of a wise old sage on a mountain.
Yeah, or like a poetic proverb on a tea bag. It sounds somewhat mystical and vague.
But the author argues we are completely misinterpreting those root words.
Totally. The author insists the terminology is highly technical, not poetic at all.
So let's break those two words apart, starting with Kitab.
Okay.
While it literally translates to book, the underlying conceptual root refers to a law or a constitution.
Right, like a codified system of rules.
Exactly. It's a document that establishes how a system actually operates.
So it's a legal framework, basically, not a collection of inspirational quotes.
Yes, exactly that. And then you pair it with Hakim.
Which comes from the root for wisdom, right? Hikmat.
Right. But within the specific context of this exegetical analysis, the author defines Hakim as meaning that these rules have a strictly rational basis.
Okay, meaning what, practically?
It implies that every single command, every single prohibition, has a clear, definable purpose in the real world.
Like a cause and effect.
Yes. And most importantly, that purpose can be logically explained to and understood by the human mind.
So the system is inherently rational.
Entirely.
I want to pause right here, because when I read this in the source material, my brain immediately hit a philosophical wall.
Oh, really? Tell me about that.
Well, let's think about the concept of God in classical theology. Like, God is defined as an omnipotent, absolutely powerful, sovereign creator.
Right. All powerful.
Yeah, and if you are a completely omnipotent being, you do not need to explain yourself.
That's a fair point.
Right. Like, if I build a computer simulation, I don't owe the digital characters an explanation for why I programmed physics engine a certain way.
You just code it.
Yeah, I just say, this is how gravity works, and that's it. Deal with it.
Right.
So why would a sovereign creator bother providing the logic behind the laws? Why lower yourself to explain the why to a creation that is infinitely smaller than you?
That is a phenomenal question. And it is actually the central philosophical tension the author addresses right away.
Okay, so how does he resolve it?
The author argues that God provides the why alongside the commands specifically and exclusively to force human beings to use their intellect.
Oh, wow. So it's intentional.
Completely. The text fundamentally rejects the concept of blind faith.
It rejects it.
Yes, it argues that a creator who designed the human brain with the capacity for rigorous critical thought would not then hand down a system that requires that brain to be turned off.
That makes so much sense. So the explanation isn't a concession to human weakness.
No, not at all.
It's actually a demand for intellectual participation.
Yes. Think about it. If the text simply commanded do this, it would bypass human reason entirely.
Right, you'd just be a biological machine executing a code, a meat robot.
Exactly, a meat robot. But by framing it as do this, and here is the underlying sociological or psychological reason why it works, the text demands that the human being engages.
As an active, intelligent participant.
Exactly. And he also points to a very specific piece of textual evidence to support this. He cites chapter 12, verse 108.
Oh, I remember this.
Yeah. In this verse, the prophet is instructed to state that he invites people to his path with basira.
Basira. I actually spent a lot of time looking at how the author unpacked that specific word.
It's a great word.
It really is. It translates roughly to insight or clear evidence, but it goes so much deeper than just like, I have a good feeling about this.
Oh, yeah. It implies a piercing logical clarity. It is proof that is visible to the intellect.
Right.
The author uses this verse to construct a really rigid rule. He says faith within this specific framework must be inextricably grounded in reason.
It has to be logical.
Yeah. If your faith does not involve your critical thinking, if you are blindly accepting a set of rituals without understanding the hikmat, the underlying wisdom and intended outcome, you are not actually practicing the faith as it was structurally designed.
Wow. Think about the cultural implications of that argument for a second.
They are massive.
They really are, because we operate in a modern society where the prevailing narrative places science and religion at opposite ends of a spectrum.
Totally. They're seen as enemies.
Right. Science is positioned as the realm of the intellect. It's about testing, measuring, asking why, demanding data.
And religion.
Religion is culturally positioned as the realm of the heart. You know, shutting up, bowing your head, asking no questions, relying purely on internal feelings.
But this text is arguing the exact opposite.
Yeah.
It's saying the foundational laws of belief are fundamentally rational.
And even more provocatively, empirically testable.
Yes. It completely reframes the relationship between the commander and the commanded.
How so?
It moves it from a dictatorship of blind obedience to a system of rational execution.
Let me try to put this into a secular analogy, because I think it really helps clarify the mechanics of what the author is saying here.
Yeah, go for it.
Think about the difference between a terrible authoritarian middle manager and a truly visionary CEO.
Okay.
A bad middle manager walks up to your desk, drops a massive stack of spreadsheets, and just says, input all this data by 5 p.m. Don't ask me why, just do it because I'm the boss and I said so.
Right. In that scenario, your intellect is entirely superfluous.
Totally. The manager just needs a pair of hands. You are completely alienated from the purpose of the work.
Right. You are a meat robot again.
Exactly. But a visionary leader operates entirely differently. They walk into the room and say, okay, team, here is our overarching strategic goal for the year. We need to reduce customer churn by 15%.
To give you the context.
Yes. And then they say, in order to achieve that, I need you to input this specific data because this will allow us to track where our service is failing. The leader has given you the rule, input the data, but they have also provided the basira, the clear insight.
They've explained the hikmat, the wisdom behind the task.
Exactly. And notice how that changes your relationship to the task.
It changes everything. You are no longer just pressing buttons, you are an active stakeholder in the outcome.
Right. You are evaluating the data as you input it because you actually understand what the data is supposed to achieve.
Which leads to a really dangerous question for any system.
What's that?
Well, if a leader gives you a task and explicitly tells you the intended outcome of that task, what happens if you do the work perfectly, but the outcome never materializes?
Oh, that's a brilliant point. If the religious laws have a rational purpose in the real world, there must be a way to measure if those laws are actually functioning.
Exactly. And that brings us to how the author insists believers must test the empirical heat of their faith.
The heat of their faith. This is my favorite part of the source text.
It's so good. The author introduces this phenomenal, incredibly grounded metaphor here to explain this testing process. It is the metaphor of fire.
Okay, walk us through the mechanics of this fire metaphor.
So imagine the systemic law, the Kitab, contains a directive, and the directive is light a fire.
Okay, simple enough.
But because it is a Hakim text, a wise, rational system, it also explains the objective of the command. It tells you why you are lighting the fire.
Right, it gives the Hikmat.
Exactly. And the intended outcome is to produce heat so that you do not freeze to death in the cold.
The objective is thermal energy. It's not just to create a nice glowing orange aesthetic for your campsite.
Precisely. The visual of the fire is entirely secondary to the function of the heat.
Makes sense.
So you go out into the cold, you gather the wood, you strike the match, you blow on the embers, you do all the correct physical steps.
You perform the ritual perfectly.
Right. But as you hold your hands over the pile, you feel absolutely nothing.
No heat at all.
Zero. The ambient temperature remains freezing. Now, what is the logical, rational response in that moment?
Right. Do you just sit there shivering, closing your eyes, and blindly chanting, "The fire is working, the fire is working, I am a good fire maker"?
No, of course not. You look at the data.
Right. The stated metric for a successful fire is heat. You are experiencing zero heat. Therefore, your fire is broken.
Exactly. You recognize an error in execution. Perhaps the wood is soaking wet.
Or maybe you gathered a pile of stones instead of wood.
Right. Or perhaps you are just waving your hands over the cold, dead ashes of a fire someone else built yesterday.
Wow.
The lack of the intended empirical result proves that your action, no matter how physically accurate it looked, is fundamentally flawed.
And the author takes this very practical metaphor of the fire, and he applies it directly to the core rituals of Islam.
He really does. Things like the daily prayers, fasting, and the pilgrimage.
Yeah. The text argues that these are not just arbitrary hoops you jump through to appease an angry deity.
Not at all. They are systemic sociological mechanisms.
This is where we really need to dive into the how. Because the author doesn't just state that rituals have a purpose. He implies the actual sociological mechanics behind them.
Let's look at the daily prayer, Salat.
Okay.
It's not just about a private moment of Zen in your bedroom. When a community synchronizes its movements.
Right.
When the CEO of a company stands shoulder to shoulder with a janitor in a physical line, bowing at the exact same moment.
Yeah, that physical synchronization.
It is a psychological mechanism designed to dissolve class boundaries.
Wow.
It builds communal discipline. It creates a highly organized, cohesive social unit.
And what about fasting?
Fasting builds psychological resilience, impulse control, and a visceral shared empathy for the impoverished.
Because everyone is feeling the exact same hunger.
Exactly. And then the pilgrimage, Hajj. It's an annual global geopolitical summit that forces disparate cultures to interact and align.
So the author's point is that the intended outcome, the heat of all these synchronized rituals, is the creation of a strong, unified, self-sustaining, and powerful society.
Yes. And here is where the author drops an absolute bombshell on his own audience.
Oh, yeah. This part is intense.
It is an incredibly controversial, demanding stance, he says. Look at your society.
Okay.
If your community is strictly performing all of these physical rituals, you are praying 5 times a day, your lines are perfectly straight, you are fasting flawlessly.
Right, the form is perfect.
But your society remains weak, politically divided, economically impoverished, or intellectually stagnant.
Then what?
He says you cannot claim you are successfully doing God's will.
Wow.
The lack of societal heat empirically proves that the community's fire is completely broken. They are just going through the motions with wet wood.
Okay, I have to push back here.
Please do.
I really need to play devil's advocate for you listening because this feels incredibly harsh.
It is harsh.
What about the concept of invisible spiritual rewards? The source text refers to this as thawab. The idea that you endure hardship here, you do your prayers, even if you are suffering under an oppressive regime, and your reward is tallied up in the afterlife.
Right, the heaven points.
Exactly, heaven points. If the ultimate goal of religion is the afterlife, then earthly weakness shouldn't matter, right? Why is the author completely dismissing the comfort of thawab?
So the author doesn't actually dismiss the existence of the afterlife, but he launches a devastating critique against how the concept of thawab is used.
Used how?
As a psychological narcotic.
Oof, a narcotic.
Yeah. The text anticipates this exact defense you just brought up. The author argues that settling for invisible, unmeasurable afterlife rewards when your earthly purpose is visibly failing is a profound form of self-deception.
Explain the mechanism of that self-deception to me. Why is it so dangerous in this framework?
Because it completely removes accountability. Think back to the fire metaphor.
Okay.
You are sitting in the freezing cold. Your family is literally shivering. The fire you built is producing no heat. But instead of evaluating your wet wood and actually fixing the problem, you convince yourself that your broken fire is secretly earning you invisible warmth in another dimension.
No, wow.
By focusing entirely on the unseen reward, you completely absolve yourself of the responsibility to fix your visible incompetence in the real world.
That is heavy. You are literally using the promise of the unseen to excuse your failure in the scene.
Exactly.
You're actively refusing to look at the data points, the ayat, that are staring you right in the face.
And the author insists that a Hakim text, a structurally wise and rational system, does not allow for that kind of delusion. It demands earthly accountability.
No excuses.
None. And to illustrate just how absurd and tragic this delusion is, the author utilizes an analogy that I think is the most memorable part of the entire text.
I know exactly where you're going. It's time we talk about the monkeys.
It is time for the monkeys.
This analogy is brilliant. Set the scene for us, because the physical reality of this story makes the critique hit so much harder.
All right, so the author asks us to picture a remote, treacherous mountain region during the dead of winter.
Okay, got her.
The temperature is brutally cold. A group of human villagers travel into this freezing environment.
And they need to survive.
Right. And they understand the mechanics of survival. They work relentlessly to chop dry wood, they arrange it to allow for airflow, and they light a massive, roaring fire.
Perfect execution.
They sit around it, they absorb the thermal energy, they get thoroughly warm, and eventually they pack up their camp and they leave.
Okay, so the humans executed the system correctly, they understood the Hikmat, and they achieved the empirical result. Heat.
Exactly. Now, high up in the canopy of the surrounding trees, a troop of monkeys has been watching this entire process unfold.
It's observing.
Right. And monkeys are phenomenal mimics, right? They possess the ability to replicate physical actions without grasping the underlying logic.
They see the what, but not the why.
Exactly. So they see the humans leave, and they themselves feel the biting cold of the winter. So they come down from the trees. They remember the physical shape of the human activity. They scrounge around the campsite, gathering whatever leftover sticks they can find.
But they don't know the rules of wood.
Right. Some sticks are damp, some are just the cold, charred remnants of the human fire.
So they are just replicating the form of the ritual.
Perfectly mimicking it. They pile up these unlit sticks. They arrange themselves in a perfect circle around this pile of nothing.
Oh, man.
They close their eyes, mimicking the relaxed posture of the humans they observed. And they sit there, completely happy, completely satisfied with themselves, pretending to be warm, while their bodies are literally freezing to death in the snow.
It is a darkly comic, yet entirely tragic image. They are literally smiling while they freeze.
It really is. And the author uses this image as a devastating critique of ritual mimicry.
Because the monkeys represent individuals or even entire communities who perform the physical shape of a religious ritual.
Yes.
But who entirely lack the functional spark that gives it life.
They mimic the form, but they are utterly ignorant of the function.
And the text draws a direct, unapologetic parallel between these monkeys and believers who are oblivious to the systemic purpose of their own faith.
The author is unsparing in this comparison. Unsparing. He suggests that many communities are perfectly content with their physical mimicry.
They just love doing the motions.
Right. They sit in their places of worship, their eyes closed, feeling incredibly self-righteous.
Yeah, they feel a deep sense of piety because they perform the physical motions with perfect accuracy.
Yet their society is completely devoid of the intended real-world power. They have zero heat.
Wow.
But because they did the motions, they just smile around a pile of cold ashes, completely convinced they're executing the will of God.
What really fascinates me about this analogy is how universally applicable it is.
Oh, it goes way beyond religion.
It does. If you strip away the theological context entirely, this is just a masterclass in behavioral psychology. This is the exact definition of a cargo cult.
Let's unpack that. How do you see this playing out outside of a religious framework? For you listening, think about where else this happens.
Well, we see this everywhere in modern society. We absolutely love to mimic success without doing the foundational work.
Oh, for sure.
Think about corporate culture. Let's say a legacy, highly bureaucratic company sees a massive tech startup thriving, right?
Right.
The startup is insanely innovative. So the legacy company sends a team over to visit. And what do they see? They see an open floor plan, beanbag chairs, and ping pong tables in the break room.
They see the physical shape of the culture.
Exactly. So the legacy company goes back to their headquarters, rips out all their cubicles, buys a dozen ping pong tables, and just waits for the innovation to magically happen.
And spoiler alert, it doesn't.
It never does. Why? Because they mimic the shape without understanding the spark.
Right.
The spark of the startup's innovation wasn't the ping pong table. It was psychological safety, rigorous hiring practices, flat management structures, and autonomous teams.
So the legacy company is just a group of monkeys sitting around a ping pong table, freezing to death financially, wondering why the fire of innovation hasn't started.
Yes. You see the exact same mimicry in the modern wellness industry, too.
Oh, absolutely. The aesthetics of health.
It's all aesthetics. People will purchase the most expensive athletic wear. They will consume the highly specific branded green smoothie.
Right. They do all the visual cues.
They will carefully curate their social media feeds to show themselves sitting in a lotus position, perfectly mimicking meditation.
But what's the actual data?
The data is that their internal anxiety remains completely unmanaged, their sleep is terrible, and their blood work shows zero improvement.
Because they are performing the ritual of wellness without engaging in the incredibly difficult systemic internal changes required to actually achieve health.
They are just going through the motions.
Because mimicry is easy.
It is. Mimicry just requires a body. Actual functional execution requires basira.
Insight.
Insight, and it requires hard work. We would rather happily freeze around unlit sticks than do the grueling work of evaluating why our systems are actually failing.
Man, that is so true. And this brings us to a really harsh reality check within the source text.
Okay, brace yourselves.
If we accept the premise that rituals must produce a tangible outcome, if warmth is the objective empirical metric for a successful fire, what is the ultimate measurable metric for a functioning faith, according to this author?
Right. How do you know on a macro geopolitical scale that a society's fire is actually producing heat?
I was struck by how blunt the text is on this point. It does not pull its punches.
No, it introduces a concept called Istikhlaf filard.
Which is a huge concept.
It is. This translates roughly to establishment on Earth or having authority, success, and stability in the geopolitical real world.
Right. And the text claims this is not just a pleasant byproduct of faith. It's not a bonus.
No, it is the absolute guaranteed outcome of true belief and righteous systemic action.
Let's define what establishment on Earth actually looks like in this context.
Okay. We are talking about intellectual dominance, economic security, societal stability, and political sovereignty.
Correct. It means having the agency to shape your own destiny as a society.
And the stark reality presented by the author is just brutal.
He says, look at the world map. Look at history.
Yeah.
If a community of believers is historically or currently weak, if they are consistently subjugated by other nations, if they're impoverished, uneducated, and hold no influence on the global stage.
What does the text say to them?
It does not offer them a shred of pity.
It doesn't offer a comforting pat on the back saying, oh, blessed are the meek, your reward is in heaven.
Exactly the opposite. It bluntly, unapologetically states that if you are failing on earth, your faith and your actions are fundamentally flawed.
Wow.
You are holding wet wood. You are the monkeys in the snow.
This is a fascinating, almost ruthless sociological argument.
It really is.
Because the author is exploring how human beings, particularly those who consider themselves deeply religious, try to squirm out of this metric.
They hate it.
Of course they do. Let's look at the logic. When believers are living under the dominion of others, when they have no agency, no power, no istikhlaf, and yet they loudly claim they are perfectly fulfilling their religious duties.
The text says they are actively lying to themselves.
Because the syllogism is inescapable. Premise 1, God promises earthly establishment to true believers.
Okay.
Premise 2, God does not break his promises.
Right.
Conclusion. If there is no earthly establishment, the failure cannot be God's. The failure must be human. The belief itself is broken.
It completely removes the victim card.
It does.
A community cannot say, oh, we're the chosen perfect people, we are doing everything right, but the rest of the world is just evil and mean to us.
Right.
The text says, no, if you are actually operating the system correctly, the system guarantees your success.
But the human ego absolutely hates accountability. We will do anything to avoid admitting that our fire is broken.
And the author highlights a very specific intellectual dodge that people use when confronted with this massive failure.
Oh, I love this part. He calls out the tendency to spiritualize the data.
Ah, yes, the spiritualization defense. This is classic psychological pivot.
It is. When confronted with the undeniable empirical data point of earthly failure, the believers will attempt to just reinterpret the promise.
Right, they change the definition.
They will say, oh, well, when God promised us establishment on earth, he didn't mean actual dirt and geopolitics.
The author points out that when these historical communities correctly followed the rational laws, the Kitab al-Hakim, they were not given an invisible spiritual kingdom in the clouds.
No, they were given actual physical geopolitical authority.
Exactly. They built robust, dominant societies. The data from history is utilized as empirical proof that the promise is material.
You know, I actually struggled with this section a bit when I was reading it.
Oh, yeah. Why is that?
Because it is a deeply materialist way of viewing religious history. It sounds dangerously close to the modern prosperity gospel.
Right. The idea that if you pray hard enough, God will buy you a luxury car.
Exactly. How does the author differentiate this framework from that kind of superficial materialism?
The distinction lies entirely in the mechanism. The prosperity gospel suggests a magical transaction, right?
Like a vending machine.
Yeah. You believe a specific theological point, and God magically drops wealth into your lap from heaven. But this text argues for a mechanical sociological reality. It says that if you follow the Hakim laws, laws that strictly enforce justice, wealth redistribution, communal solidarity, and intellectual rigor, those laws will naturally engineer a strong, prosperous society.
Ah, I see. So the wealth isn't a magical reward dropped from the sky.
No, it is the logical heat generated by a well-built social fire. Cause and effect. Rational law leads to tangible result.
Which inevitably forces us to confront the elephant in the room when it comes to religion.
And what's that?
Well, if we are talking about strict cause and effect, if signs or ayat are actually logical data points, and if the metric of faith is earthly success and rational coherence, where on earth do magic and miracles fit into all of this?
Boom. This is where the text executes its most profound paradigm shift. We have to address humanity's historical obsession with the supernatural.
It really is an obsession. It spans every culture, every era.
We desperately want magic tricks.
We do. We want prophets who can split the moon in half. We want seas parted with a stick. We want people floating, defying physics, turning water into wine.
We deeply equate holiness with breaking the laws of nature.
Exactly. But the author, drawing on the logic of the source text, offers a radical redefinition here.
He argues that supernatural, or what he terms super-intellectual or super-rational miracles, are not actually proof of the divine.
No.
No. They are actually an insult to human intelligence.
Wait, an insult? That is a massive claim. Almost every major world religion is built on a foundation of supernatural miracles.
Yeah.
How can the text argue it's an insult?
Let's follow the author's logic step by step.
Okay, let's do it.
If a phenomenon fundamentally bypasses the human intellect, if it cannot be reasoned with, if it shatters the very laws of cause and effect that the human mind relies on to understand reality,
right,
then it cannot, by definition, be part of a wise book.
Because a Kitab al-Hakim operates on rational, explainable laws.
Exactly. A magic trick suspends rational laws. Therefore, relying on magic as your primary proof is antithetical to the entire system.
It basically tells the human brain, your logic is completely useless here.
Yes. And the author traces this historically, pointing out this really frustrating pattern of human behavior.
What's the pattern?
Throughout history, whenever a messenger arrived with a set of rational laws designed to fix a broken, unjust society, the people instinctively rejected them.
But they didn't reject the laws logically, right?
No. They didn't debate the economics or the social policies. They rejected the messenger because he was just a normal guy.
Ah. Yes, the text uses the concept of the bashar, which means a normal, mortal human being.
Right. The source material notes how the crowds would literally mock the messengers, saying, "Why should we listen to you? You eat food, you walk in the marketplace, you have a family, you get sick just like we do."
If God really wanted to send a message, he would have sent an angel or a demigod or some supernatural entity.
They demanded the messenger be superhuman.
And why is that? Because if the messenger is superhuman, you don't actually have to evaluate the message.
That is the exact psychological mechanism. Let's break down why the text rejects supernatural miracles as proof of truth.
Let's do it.
Imagine I come to you with a complex, brilliant mathematical equation that proves we need to fundamentally change our economic system right now to prevent a total societal collapse.
Okay, so I have to look at your math. I have to use my brain to verify your claims.
Right. It requires serious intellectual labor on your part.
Yeah.
But imagine I come to you with the exact same claim, and to prove I'm right, I suddenly shoot lasers out of my eyes and levitate 10 feet off the ground.
Oh, I am instantly going to do whatever you say. I will sign any document you put in front of me immediately.
Exactly. But are you doing it because my economic theory is sound?
Yeah.
Have you achieved Bazura insight and conviction regarding the economic system?
No, I haven't even looked at the math. I'm doing it because I'm absolutely terrified of the laser eye man.
Yes. You are acting out of fear and awe, not reason. I have forced you to submit by dazzling you, by overwhelming your sensory processing. I have completely bypassed your critical thinking.
And true conviction requires logical engagement.
Exactly. A magic trick produces submission out of awe or terror. It does not produce rational conviction. And a system that demands intellectual engagement cannot rely on terror.
Man, this is where the text uses another fantastic analogy to highlight the absurdity of this human demand for magic.
The snake on the path.
I love this one. It perfectly exposes how irrational we are when we demand miracles.
Set it up for us.
So imagine you were walking down a narrow, winding mountain path, right?
Okay.
Suddenly, a man comes running in the opposite direction, just sprinting toward you. He stops, completely out of breath, grabs you by the shoulders and says, "Stop. Do not go any further. There is a massive, deadly, venomous snake right around the corner blocking the path."
Or maybe she says, "There's a flash flood approaching. The bridge is washed out."
Right. He is providing a practical, real-world warning about a systemic danger. He's explaining cause and effect. If you keep walking, you will die.
It's a completely rational claim.
Now, imagine your response to this man is to cross your arms, look him up and down skeptically, and say, "I refuse to believe your warning unless you miraculously milk out of your own hair right now."
It sounds completely ridiculous when you frame it that way.
It's absurd. I remember reading that and just laughing out loud. What does milking hair have to do with the snake?
Nothing.
What does a supernatural parlor trick have to do with the practical reality of a flood warning?
Nothing at all. They are entirely disconnected phenomena. The rational response to that man is not to demand a suspension of the laws of physics.
No, the rational response is to evaluate the claim using empirical data.
Exactly. You look at the environment. Are there signs of a flood? Has it been raining heavily? Does this mountain environment actually support venomous snakes?
Right. And most importantly, you evaluate the credibility of the data source, the actual person giving the warning.
You audit the messenger. Does this man look genuinely terrified? Does he have a history of lying to people on this road? Has he ever tried to deceive you before? Does he have anything to gain by tricking you?
You look for behavioral data points. Demanding a magic trick in the face of a practical, real-world warning is just a profound sign of intellectual immaturity.
It really is. And if we connect this analogy to the broader theological argument, the text is saying that prophets are simply men running down the path of history, warning society that their current sociological, economic, or moral behaviors, their broken systems are a snake on the path.
The inevitable consequence of injustice is societal collapse.
Yes. And the crowds responded by saying, "Make a camel come out of a rock, or we won't fix our economy."
Which completely misses the point of the message. It is a total evasion tactic.
Exactly.
Okay, but this raises the ultimate question, and it's really the climax of the author's argument today.
Right.
If magic isn't the proof of a prophet's message, if supernatural parlor tricks are an insult to the intellect and a distraction from the real issues, what is the data point? If a normal human being claims to be bringing a Kitab al-Hakim, a rational system from the Creator, how do you empirically validate their claim without magic? What is the standard of proof?
The author reveals that the ultimate proof, the truest miracle within this framework, is not a manipulation of nature at all.
What is it?
It is a mathematically consistent, deeply honest human life.
An open book of a life.
Exactly. The author anchors this point by quoting the prophet directly from the Quran, Surah 10, verse 16.
Okay.
When the crowd surrounded him and demanded a supernatural sign, a magic trick to prove his authority, the prophet was instructed to reply with one simple, devastating sentence.
Let's hear it.
I have lived among you a lifetime before this. Will you not then use your reason?
I have lived among you a lifetime before this. Let's unpack the sheer confidence, the absolute flex of that statement.
We really need to understand the historical context here.
Right, because the prophet was 40 years old when he first announced his prophethood. For 4 decades, he lived in the exact same community.
He wasn't a mysterious hermit living in a cave on a distant mountain who just suddenly appeared out of nowhere one day.
No, he was deeply embedded in the social fabric. He was a merchant. He walked in the local markets. He interacted with hundreds of people daily.
He handled money, negotiated complex trade contracts, resolved disputes. He experienced all the mundane realities of human existence.
He was entirely visible. He was an open, auditable record of human behavior.
And the miracle he is presenting to the skeptics is those 40 years of flawless character prior to his claim.
Wow.
The author synthesizes this beautifully. He points out the psychological consistency required for that argument to hold any weight.
The behavioral baseline?
Exactly. The text asserts a fundamental psychological truth. Human beings operate on patterns.
Always.
A person who does not lie for 40 years about ordinary, mundane things. A person who is scrupulously honest in business, who returns lost property, who never cheats a neighbor, who never exaggerates for personal gain or prestige. That person does not suddenly wake up on a Tuesday in their 40s and decide to invent the most massive, audacious, dangerous lie conceivable about being the mouthpiece of the creator of the universe.
It violates all behavioral data. Look at history. Look at modern true crime, for example.
Oh, absolutely.
People who construct massive society-altering frauds almost always have a track record of smaller frauds. Con men have a history of cons. Pathological liars lie about small things before they lie about big things.
To go from a baseline of absolute zero deception over 4 decades to the ultimate blasphemous deception overnight is psychologically incoherent.
And the prophet's contemporaries knew this. They had the data.
They did. And the author references a phenomenal piece of historical documentation to illustrate this exact point.
Yes, the story of Abu Sufyan and Emperor Heraclius of the Byzantine Empire.
The courtroom drama. I loved reading this part of the source material.
It's so good. Set the stage for us because the political dynamics here are just fascinating.
Okay, so early in the prophet's mission, he sends diplomatic letters to neighboring rulers, including Emperor Heraclius, inviting him to the faith.
Right.
Heraclius, being a seasoned, cynical geopolitical leader, doesn't just blindly believe a letter. He wants intel. He wants data.
Naturally.
He happens to find out that Abu Sufyan, one of the chief leaders of Mecca, is currently trading in Byzantine territory.
And we need to clarify, at this specific point in history, Abu Sufyan is a bitter, violent enemy of the prophet.
He is actively trying to destroy the new religion.
So Heraclius literally calls the claimant's worst enemy to the stand to cross-examine him. He's bringing in a hostile witness.
Exactly. Heraclius summons Abu Sufyan into his royal court for an interrogation, and Heraclius asks a series of very calculated questions.
And notice what he doesn't ask.
Right. He doesn't ask if the prophet split the moon. He doesn't ask if the prophet has supernatural powers or controls the weather.
He asks exclusively about behavioral data.
One of the key questions Heraclius asked Abu Sufyan is, did you ever accuse him of lying before he said what he says now?
And Abu Sufyan, who wants nothing more than to discredit the prophet, who is literally at war with him, he is trapped by the empirical reality of the prophet's life.
He has to swallow his pride and answer honestly in front of the emperor.
What does he say?
He say, no, we never found him to be a liar.
Wow. And then Heraclius delivers his verdict based on that behavioral data. He says, I knew that if he was a man who did not lie about people, he was not a man who would lie about God.
That just gives me chills.
Yeah.
That is a pure, logical deduction based on an empirical behavioral sample size.
Heraclius didn't need a magic trick. He looked at a 40-year audit of character.
And the author uses this historical exchange to hammer home his final point. Psychological consistency, lived integrity is the ultimate empirical sign. The Ayat.
It is the only miracle that respects the human intellect.
Exactly. Because it requires the observer to evaluate data over time. It requires you to use your brain.
I really want you, the listener, to just reflect on this standard of proof for a second. Think about how completely this shifts the burden of proof.
It's massive.
It takes the burden away from the heavens, away from waiting for stars to align, or magic staffs to turn into snakes, or voices to boom from the clouds, and it places it squarely on human behavior.
A truthful life is an open book that anyone can audit. That is a measurable data point.
It's an incredibly empowering framework, but as we discussed earlier, it is also a terrifyingly demanding one.
Because it means you can't fake it. You can't just memorize a chant or wear a specific outfit or sit around a pile of cold ashes and pretend you are enlightened.
The system demands empirical proof of concept.
Let's take a moment to briefly recap the intellectual journey we've just been on, because the author has woven a very dense, cohesive philosophical tapestry today.
Yeah, let's trace the steps.
We started with the foundational concept of a Kitab al-Hakim, a wise book. This defined the text not as a collection of mystical poems, but as a system of laws rooted in profound, explainable logic.
Completely rejecting the premise of blind obedience.
Right. From there, we explored how a rational system demands empirical testing. The fire must produce heat.
The rituals of faith must produce a strong, unified, functioning society. And if they don't, you aren't actually practicing the faith. You're just a monkey in the snow, mimicking the shape of a fire, completely oblivious to the fact that you are freezing to death.
Exactly. We then confronted the ultimate metric for that societal heat. Istikhlaf fil ard, earthly establishment and success.
We looked at how this harsh metric strips away the comforting psychological excuses of spiritual kingdoms and demands real-world competence and sovereignty.
And finally, we saw how this relentlessly logical system redefines the very nature of miracles. It rejects supernatural magic tricks as insults to the intellect,
replacing them with the super-rational, irrefutable data point of a lived human life. A 40-year track record of flawless character as the ultimate Ayat.
It is an argument that demands absolutely everything from the believer's intellect and critical thinking, and demands nothing from their credulity or fear.
And why does this matter to you today? Why did we spend this time unpacking a specific theological commentary on the opening verses of Surah Yunus?
Because the mental models presented here are universal. They transcend theology completely.
They really do. Whether you are evaluating a religious text, deciding on a political claim during an election year, or analyzing a new business strategy at your company, the methodology holds up.
Demand the why. When someone gives you a rule, don't just follow it blindly. Understand the Hikmat, the underlying wisdom and intended outcome.
Test the heat of your actions. If your corporate culture is doing all the physical rituals of innovation, but the company is failing, your fire is broken. Stop mimicking and start analyzing the data.
And above all, when a leader asks you to follow them, ignore the magic tricks of their charisma, their marketing, or their rhetoric. Look for the data points of their character over time.
It is a profound call to intellectual rigor in every aspect of human life.
It really is. And as we conclude, I want to leave you with a final lingering idea to mull over. It builds on everything the author has argued, but takes it one step further into pure philosophical inquiry.
Oh, I love these. Lay it on us.
If we accept the foundational premise of this text, if the creator of the universe specifically designed the human intellect as the primary, exquisite tool for understanding reality.
Okay, I'm tracking with you.
And if that creator intentionally designed signs, not as magic tricks, but as logical data points meant to be rigorously analyzed by that intellect,
right,
then wouldn't the act of blind faith actually be the ultimate act of rebellion?
Oh, wow.
By choosing to believe without thinking, by demanding a magic trick instead of analyzing the reality of the world, are we actually rejecting the very tool we were explicitly commanded to use?
Wow. Let that sink in for a second. If the designer gave you an incredibly complex, powerful machine to see the truth, choosing to close your eyes and just guess isn't an act of piety at all.
No, it's a profound insult to the machine, and by extension, an insult to the designer.
It flips the entire paradigm of faith completely on its head.
It really does.
What an incredible place to end. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Thank you for letting us unpack these complex ideas, for wrestling with the analogies, and for bringing your curiosity to the table.
It's been a great conversation.
We'll be back next time with another stack of sources to explore. Until then, keep your eyes open, keep analyzing the data, and make sure your fire is actually producing heat. Take care.